We waiting for anybody? Andy on his way?
Yeah, he'll be a little late today.
All right. Was John planning on coming in today? Do you remember?
I think he was, yeah. I don't
I
know.
didn't talk to him yesterday.
Joan.
Okay. Who would like to open us up in prayer?
I can open this up.
Thank you.
Lord, we bless your holy name. And thank you for this morning. Lord, I pray for this people in this time that we would open our hearts and our minds to what you may share with us. Pray that we would be receiving and so willing to give. I pray that your way of life would continue to be instilled within us and practiced by us. Pray this in your holy name.
Amen. Okay. Isaac and Jaden, read this 13:16. Is that she? Duke of she? Is that
It's Duke of Shill.
Shua? The Duke of Shua asked about governing. The master said, "Act so that those near to you are pleased, and those who are far from you are drawn closer."
The Duke, personal name Zagao, was lord of the walled city of Shi, within the powerful state of Chu. Alternate versions of this encounter appear in many warring state texts. The only significantly different one, found in Motse, gives Confucius's answer as, "Those who are good at governing draw close to them those who are far away, and renew that which is old." The point seems to concern rule by virtue, whereby common people are naturally drawn to the kind and good ruler. The message may be especially intended for the Duke of Shu because of the harsh legalistic practices apparently practiced in the state of Chu, as well as Chu's policy of aggressive military expansion. I like the relationship because I think it's like a restating of the that main point again in that little subtext with the those who are good at governing draw close to them who are far away, which is the same thing, but then renew that which is old is sort of synonymous or in the same place as act so those who are near to you are pleased. I think there's an interesting connection there.
I'm trying to figure out, is he speaking against the Duke?
I think a little bit of a recommendation. I think just because of that last bit at the end. ruling by virtue is definitely different than ruling legalistic practices.
It's hard to tell what's going on there. Like if people were drawn to that state or not. I mean, I see the principle there. I don't see the application to that one ruler. But I'm guessing that if he was harsh and legalistic, that
People were not naturally
he was
drawn.
not kind and good.
Yeah. That's how I took it.
There's been a similar statement before, in the observation of, the progression that takes place. I think who was one of the students had, or the disciples had made a comment about a state that was very attractive and a lot of people were moving into it. And then Confucius mentioned kind of the next stage of development for that people. Which one was that? That wasn't very long ago. But it was the same observation that when these rural people who live in a certain way are drawn to a ruler, it's because of certain ways that he does things. It was 13:9. The master traveled away with Rentree and his carriage driver. Upon arriving, the master remarked, "How numerous the people of the state are." Rentree asked, "Being already numerous, what can be done to further improve them, make them wealthy? Once they're wealthy, what can be done to improve them, instruct them?" That principle of voting with their feet, going to the place that there's good rule. So, we have here the rule by virtue, whereby common people are naturally drawn to the kind and good ruler. There's a little bit of an overlap there with that same principle. It's voting without voting. It's kind of interesting, right? It's the natural result of good rule, as opposed to, making your opinion known in a certain way without the practice.
I think it's an interesting concept compared to voting because the focus seems different, and I kind of like it a little more. I don't know, it's what you were saying, kind of with the voting with their feet thing, but it's a bit different because it's the good rulers attract the people, not the people simply gathering up and electing who they think exactly. But it's almost kind of like fruit versus like something forced and artificial. It's like the fruit of a good ruler produces people coming into the nation. Whereas I think when you're, electing what you think is a good ruler or whatever else, it very often can produce something not quite what you think it is.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one is mostly based in ideals, and the other is
Action.
the product of practice.
It's more real.
So politicians sell you ideals and haven't put anything into practice.
That's what I'm saying. I kind of like, this is obviously our current society doesn't work this way, but it'd be interesting to see if it would. And outside of like state legislation, there's not much relation.
Well, it kind
to
of
how it
does.
is.
Righteous rule. I mean, this is the thing that God said that He would establish in the world with the kingdom, is that the product of righteous rule will draw the nations. So, but even in our country, I'm not saying this is the rule, the order of law that we have, or order of government that we have. But you do see a lot of migration take place in the states right now. So people are generally speaking, migrating to better legislation. So not necessarily to good rulers so much, or a specific ruler, but to what they see as more fruitful. So, as it relates to the business environment in the U.S., there's a lot of migration taking place. Of the big companies, the big corporate companies, and even small businesses are moving to places where the government favors their work as opposed to tries to control it and master it. So that's people are still voting with their feet and moving their homes and their livelihoods and everything else like that. So we've seen that a lot in our country with a bit of an exodus from the West Coast because of the difficulty of the rulers or the governing order in these areas. So people have a tendency to do it regardless of even the governmental structure that they're under. And so it is a very telling principle. David was much like that too when he was exiled from Saul. It says that there were a certain constituency of people that came to him, and not because he called them, but because they knew who he was, they knew his situation. And it wasn't just, so think about that in the context of someone who was becoming a very self-centered ruler and becoming more protective of his own rule, that being Saul. And when he rejected David, he did that very publicly. It's not like he got up and made an announcement, but it was a very well-known scenario. And so those who were also being, in a sense, oppressed by the ruler of the day and the way that he did things came to David, not because we come to support you because you were wronged, but our plight, we see what has happened, and we have seen your way of doing things, and so we want to come to follow you, which even played all the way through until Saul and Jonathan's death. Even then, David did not claim the throne, but those who knew who he was came to him to ask him to then rule in a place. It was a very interesting positioning of the elders of a community would stand at the gate, and the gate was the place of discernment and judgment in any city or town. And so later on, you see in the reigns of other kings, and even in David's, when his own son basically came against him, Absalom, he would stand at the gate to try to gain the people's hearts. That's where everybody talked about how things worked and how things were governed in that place. And so it's just it's a little bit of a broader stretch from this particular point, but okay. Elijah and Naomi, read 13:17.
Ziah, who was serving as steward of Zephu, asked about governing. The master said, "Do not crave speed, and do not be enticed by the prospect of minor gains. If you crave speed, then you will never arrive. And if you are distracted by the prospect of minor gains, you will never complete major tasks."
So typically when they use a word and show you the Chinese, there's some sort of principle by what it means. For instance, what does it mean to arrive? Do you have any knowledge of that word there?
That particular one, no. Like I know, like other words that mean arrive, but I'm guessing this has a different meaning than just location. Kind of arrive, and I could Like a little forward. Looks like it. Yeah, sorry. Kind of means like to reach something as it's kind of a interesting one there, but I'm not sure of the.
It obviously has some connection to fulfillment or completion. Naomi, go ahead.
Jifu was a walled city in the state of Wu. Most commentators believed that, how do you say that?
This yeah.
Jisia had overly ambitious plans for reforming it on taking over as steward, and that Confucius' words were meant to restrain him. Also, see the criticism of the petty scholar official in 1320 below with regard to his actions. He insists that they bear fruit. In 1214, where Confucius advises Zihan to be patient as a ruler, occupy your position without worrying, and implement your rule by means of dutifulness.
No, what do you think the greater context of that word dutifulness is as defined in the Analects?
It's like consistency to and adherence to ritual. There's one line where the master tells one disciple that all of his teaching could be explained with 2 strands or something like that, and then the disciple's confused as to what that means, and another disciple says, man, he's really told you a lot there. What he meant was that all of his teaching depends on understanding and dutifulness. Understanding referring to, actually, it's the term shu, which has everything to do actually with the golden rule we were talking about last night, which is itself balanced by dutifulness, which has more to do with the way that one carries himself and views his life, circumstances, and his responsibilities according to what is the way of righteousness or the way of ritual. But the way that this dynamic works, or seems to work, between these 2 principles, dutifulness and understanding, is that sometimes one needs to apply a discretion to the way that ritual or righteous action is to be executed, or how it is to play out, because sometimes if we overlook the, I guess what you might call the relational part of that, then we can act in what becomes a very legalistic way. I mean, we just read in the previous Analect about the master seeking to temper somewhat this person who comes from a state that was typically very harsh and legalistic and militant.
Mm-hmm.
And that can come about in a personality, an individual, when there is this overemphasis on dutifulness without understanding. So there's no there's no human kindness shown in the exercise of what is the right thing to do. this is the way that the Chinese philosophers would balance these things, because in many other places Confucius talks about how even things like trustworthiness can be you can overshoot the mark with trustworthiness to the point where you actually are trustworthy to a fault. You can overshoot the mark with I'm trying to think of other virtues. Or other things they mentioned. With courage is another one we see in a student like Zulu, who very often overshot the mark in that regard. And all of that comes in the realm of relationships from a lack of understanding, from a lack of shu. And the principle of shu is encapsulated in the statement given by Confucius, which is basically the inverse of the golden rule given by Jesus. As we know in the scriptures, it's do unto others as you would have them do to you. Confucius says, don't do to others what you would not have them do to you. And so that's just a way
Which, by the way, just to clarify, is not that's not opposite.
No, of
yeah,
course
they do
not.
the same thing.
They're complementary.
Two sides of the same coin. But just if you really think about that statement, like apply it to your own life, your own circumstances and relationships, it's a way to reach into, a way for your perspective to reach into another life, to not see things from such a limited individual point of view, which is all too possible, even if you are walking out dutifulness, even if you're desiring to live righteously and according to what you know to be the right thing. You can do so to a fault without understanding. And Confucius' teaching, as observed by a disciple that received that somewhat enigmatic statement from Confucius. Confucius' teachings are the weaving together of those two strands of understanding, which is balanced by dutifulness and vice versa. So dutifulness, though, to answer your question originally, is that adherence to ritual, to the way, in a very conscious and intentional sense.
Well, you were describing that kind of reminds me of these steps of sonship in that way, and how dutifulness relates very much to that submission to God and that servant nature that he does ask of us, but that is incomplete without understanding, which, as far as I see it in that same analogy, is the relationship with God, taking you out of strictly servanthood and into sonhood or sonship. And I think it very much goes along with that analogy of the dutifulness is the adherence to the Lord's commands, but the understanding, the context, the actual reason for doing anything is the relationship, is the understanding.
Mm-hmm.
Because even with a dutifulness to God, even with a servanthood to what he is desiring, it lacks complete context without a relationship, without understanding.
I'll just point you to that Analect I referenced earlier, and it's in 4:15.
4:15. I went over that one for those.
The master said, Master Zheng, all that I teach can be strung together on a single thread. Guan means thread, and Huang Kan reads it as a metaphor. Everything that the master teaches is unified theoretically by one principle, like objects strung on a single thread. The Analects' emphasis on practice over theory makes it likely, however, that the single thread is a kind of consistency in action rather than a unified theoretical principle. Mm-hmm. And this is supported by Master Zheng's elaboration below. See the commentary to 15.3. Okay. Yes, sir, Master Zheng responded. After the master left, the disciples asked, what did he mean by that? Master Zheng said, all that the master teaches amounts to nothing more than dutifulness tempered by understanding. I guess it'd be worth reading that.
Mm-hmm.
Although there is a general agreement on the meaning of shu, commentators differ considerably regarding their understandings of zheng. There are quite a few passages in the Analects directly or indirectly concerned with shu, and it is clear that this virtue involves some sort of consideration of others, an ability to imaginatively project oneself into another's place. There is more debate about zheng.
Hold on, that's kind of interesting because that's understanding seems to be somewhat correlated to what we were talking about in the relational quotients.
Mm-hmm.
You know, to be able to really understand people.
Is exactly what I was saying with the relationship. That's really funny.
One dominant line of interpretation begins with Wang Bi, who defines zheng as fully exhausting one's emotions, and shu as reflecting upon one's emotions in order to have sympathy with other beings. Zhu Shi and others belong to this line of thinking in defining zheng as exhausting oneself or doing one's utmost. Relying solely upon relevant passages from within the Analects, however, it would seem that zheng involves a kind of attention to one's ritual duties, particularly as a political subordinate. Understood this way, being dutiful involves fulfilling the duties and obligations proper to one's ritually defined role. This virtue is to be tempered by the virtue of understanding, the ability to, by means of imaginatively putting oneself in the place of another, know when it is appropriate or right to bend or suspend the dictates of role-specific duty. Zheng is often translated as loyalty, but dutifulness is preferable because the ultimate focus is upon one's ritually prescribed duties rather than loyalty to any particular person. And indeed, zheng would involve opposing a ruler who is acting improperly.
This is like that in part is actually almost word for word that paper I wrote for your class on rules. Remember when we went over that for the writing? Like almost word for word that last bit. How rules and whatnot are necessary, even more so for a particular time when you're an infant, but that it is ultimately trumped by relationship with the father.
Mm-hmm.
That's really funny. It's like there's a lot of correlation there.
So some of the underlying principle here is to stay consistent. That's the don't crave speed and don't be enticed by the prospect of minor gains. So there's a lot of distractions. The minor gain may not be, it's definitely not equivalent to the major accomplishments, but it can also be something that is diverts your path. And so the speed indicates you may not arrive because you don't. I think about this in the way that I used to run, short marathon races. So we did this deal at the school that I went to every year. It was a fundraiser, but like you would run for a period of time and then you would count the laps and you try to get people to support you. Like how much will you donate for every lap that I run? And so when you were doing that, depending on what your goal was, you want to, for me, it was never about raising money. It was about seeing who could do the most laps. So, if you're in that group of people and you want to get ahead of everybody, then in a long race, that was a 30-minute run. So you can't sprint for 30 minutes. You can sprint for about 2 minutes. Okay? And so if you sprint and then you completely exhaust yourself, then you're basically walking at a fast pace for the rest of the race with a little here and there. And so there were all different kind of runners. So you'd have the people that they're going to get out ahead. So you start the race and they're so far ahead of everybody. And then you have other people who start fast and then they slow down and then they'll run again and then they'll slow down. And they'll run again and they'll slow down. And what I did was to start at a pace that I thought I could maintain the whole time. and I would end up lapping. So you would get an entire lap ahead again and again of the people who didn't have consistency in their in the way that they ran, and that came all the way down to the length of your stride, the pace of your breathing, everything. I can still feel it right now in my body. My breathing pace, my stride, whatever else. And so, I think I did like 30 something laps in that period of time, which was the equivalent of, I don't know, a few miles. I think 4 laps on that track was either 4 or 8. It was a mile. It was a small track, but anyway. The point is that you have to pace yourself. And it's not about yourself, it's about consistency in the way that you do things and not trying to. So, like, that minor gain might be, well, I ran really fast and I passed this person, but you tired yourself out so much that you quit the race. You didn't even finish. You weren't able to complete in the time that you were allotted. And so this is a life rule related to a discipline of life and the fruits that can be produced through a discipline of life, which is connected to what we just read and what Noah shared or read through regarding dutifulness and understanding. Let's look then at 13:20, since it was referenced ahead, and then we'll jump backwards. Esther, if you'll read 13:20. I'll read the second part of it.
Zedong asked, "What does a person have to be like before he could be called a true scholar official?" The master said, conducting himself with a sense of shame and not dishonoring his ruler mandate when sent abroad as a diplomat. Such a person could be called a scholar official. May I ask what the next best type of person is like? His lineage and clan consider him filial, and his fellow villagers consider him respectful to his elders. And the next best? In his speech, he insists on being trustworthy, and with regard to his actions, he insists that they bear fruit. What a narrow, rigid little man he is, and yet he might still be considered the next best. How about those who today are involved in government? The master exclaimed, "Oh, those petty functionaries are not even worth considering."
Here again, the flexibility and true grace of the gentleman is contrasted with those who are simply renowned or well-known, and those who are too narrowly focused on trustworthiness or attaining results. As Mencius observes, the great person is not always necessarily true to his word because he is concerned only with rightness. Apparently, even such narrow, rigid officials are to be preferred to the vessels or petty functionaries, literally translated as peck and basket men. We might have rendered more colloquially as bean counters, who dominated public life in Confucius' age.
I don't know what bean counters mean. That's not on my colloquial.
It's like scrutinizing. It's kind of like micromanagement.
Okay, gotcha.
I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but the Chinese have a little story to demonstrate the effect of excessive trustworthiness. Where there's a young man and young lady who love each other, and the young man promises to meet her that evening under the bridge of their village. And of course, that evening, a great storm occurs, and there's a lot of rain, and the river underneath that bridge is
Really
likely
high.
to flood.
Mm.
But the young man, true to his word, still goes to the bridge. Of course, the young lady doesn't, because she knows it's going to flood, and she's told by her parents not to. But the young man still does, and he waits there for her. She never comes, and a flood occurs, and he's killed. And that was the result of his excessive trustworthiness.
I love Chinese parables. That's
Yeah.
really, that's
But you can think of many instances in which staying true to one's word simply for the sake of staying true to one's word, even in spite of circumstances that may arise where it's actually very unwise and not even in the greater scheme of things conscientious for you to do so. It comes mainly from a place of pride, obviously, and self-righteousness.
So then how would you explain this difference here as it's mentioned, the difference between being true to your word and that over trustworthiness and rightness? So the statement that Mencius says is a great person is not always necessarily true to his word because he is concerned only with rightness. So there's a differentiation there.
Right, and staying true to your word is evidently not always the right thing to do, because you can be blinded by this sense of this shallow sense of virtue you have in yourself, and because of that are only able to see or try to be consistent to this idea of virtue. And it's tragic, really, when that is what blinds you to what is actually right, what is actually virtuous. So, in the example given in that parable, what was the right thing to do? It wasn't to stay true to his word and go to the bridge and remain there. It was to see that there was a life-threatening storm and stay home like his girlfriend did.
I think I'm honestly with that kind of reminded of what it means to hold things with an open hand, because I feel like with the type of person that is that level of fulfilling his own word and trustworthy and whatnot, I think there is a very a measure of black and white that type of person views the world through. You know what I mean? There is a very you have very clearly defined principles in your mind, and things that do not meet up to that are immediately deemed incorrect. You know what you kind of get what I'm saying with that? And I think I'm kind of reminded of just, I think a lot of the journey, at least my journey as a son, has been the letting go of certain principles that I used to hold in this black and white arena. You know what I mean? And very much letting go and allowing those things to fall into a kind of up in the air, things I'm not quite sure about, and letting the Lord settle those things in my heart. There's an analogy I was thinking of with this, but I think I've lost it, unfortunately. But I have noticed with several different things that things I don't even think I hold on to super tightly, the Lord very quickly points out to me, no, that right there, you gotta let go of that.
Mm-hmm.
I think of that one conversation I had with you and Tim over that book we were reading for Justin's class, and just like really forcing me to let go of convictions that I was holding super strongly, my own convictions, right? And I think it was what you were saying earlier. A lot of that is a form of pride. You are very convinced that you are right in something, and you're not willing to compromise on that because you feel like it's a loss of your own identity by compromising on that.
Mm-hmm.
one thing that's important to just recognize here is that there's a difference between, because of the word true and rightness, these words that we use, the idea that you are not necessarily, as Mencius describes, true to your word, does not equate to or mean that you are not faithful to truth. See, there's a difference between, truth doesn't change. So your commitment to your own principle,
That's
may need more context. But being faithful to truth is not is a non-negotiable.
Well, that's what it means to be concerned only with rightness. No?
Mhm.
Yeah. I think the key there is necessarily true to his word, to your own principles. But your pursuit should always be righteousness or rightness. Truth.
Mencius gave some examples of the ancient sage kings, and how each one responded differently to the same scenario. And obviously, they lived at different times, and they interacted with different people, and the circumstances, the details of the circumstances were somewhat different, but in essence, they were the same scenarios. I don't remember exactly what those were. But each one responded in a different way, or with a different course of action. But what Mencius observes is that these rulers all abided by and acted in the same way, the way, nonetheless. And he said that if they had exchanged their places and their times and circumstances, they would have done the very same thing that the other would have done in their place. So that there's what he's meaning to say there is that there's one way. There's one truth that each one knows and acts and walks in, which points to what is conveyed in Confucian thought, and as later expounded by Mencius, a one truth ideology, if you will. There's other ways to put that, but there's a lot that, even with what we're looking at right here, and in other instances, I'd say especially in something like Mencius, there can be a misinterpretation of what he's saying in relativistic terms, which is to say that everybody's idea of rightness or of what is good, what is true, depends on one's own perspective, one's point of view. That's a way that it can very easily be misinterpreted. But if there's a more careful and honest reading of any of these texts, you see that the complete opposite is the truth. Why else would they be speaking about the way? There's one way that governs what is good, what is right, what is the truth. And sometimes there are scenarios, there are circumstances that arise in which our lesser and more limited sense of what is right as far as trustworthiness goes, or as far as consistency goes, or even uprightness or courage goes, we have to act in such a way that seems to somewhat contradict those things. But it's not because we are led by this feeling against them. In fact, what we feel as those with good and pure hearts is actually a bit of a resistance from acting outside of them. But sometimes we're the Spirit will require us to enlarge our perspectives a little bit beyond what seems to fit more neatly and consistently with this framework of what is right, what makes the most sense, what is basing one experience on other experiences of the past. Those are always very great learning and maturing experiences for us. And again, even the way that I'm putting it, as carefully as I'm trying to, it can still be seeming to come across as if there's some kind of transcendency over morals, but that's not the case. Even as Jade mentioned some conversations we've had before about rules and that black and white way of understanding. What we're doing is not moving outside of or away from the rules. We're actually moving into the very heart of them, the very source of them, and learning to act and think and live from that heart and source, not from the. It's like the metaphor of the molten lead that Oswald Chambers gives us. We can take cooled and shaped and solid forms from that molten state, or we can be found in the very midst of its heat and working power. And that is eventually where we are to be and to live from and to think unto.
So expounding a little bit on what he references as the peck and basket men, the petty functionaries, those who in essence pay so much attention to the details that they overlook the major things. And I think that was kind of the reference that was being made in 13:17 as well. Those being like the minor gains, those things that can become distractions. And then of course, in Mench's comments in 13:20, this reference to petty functionaries, which is also what Confucius called them. They don't produce anything good. The fruit is not really born out of their life. And so, he says they're not even worth considering. I found that very interesting in the context of what Jesus says in relation to the religious rulers of his own day. In Matthew 23 and following, he says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you've neglected the more important matters of the law." So the small things for the big things. Isn't that what he said? Prospect of minor gains, you will never complete the major tasks. But you have neglected the more important matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced. So here we have again the whole principle of actually putting into practice virtue and rightness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. So there, we have what was previously mentioned as the renown, to be known, to be thought of. So that was at the beginning of the comment on 13:20. Here again, the flexibility and true grace of the gentleman is contrasted with those who are simply renowned, and those who are too narrowly focused on certain aspects. Blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside will also be clean. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You're like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of dead men's bones and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside you appear to people, that's the renown, as righteous, but on the inside you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You build tombs for the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous. So it seems like you honor those things, right? And you say, if we had lived in the days of our forefathers, kind of a reference to the sage kings, because they practice a certain way of life, then they would have made the same decisions that their contemporary or their former ruler would have made during that time, because they practiced a certain way. But here, in this other mode, so they honor on the outside, and then they say, if we had lived in the days of our forefathers, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves that you are descendants of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of the sin of your forefathers. So here they are, in the midst, they're currently rejecting one appointed by or sent by God, at the same time saying that they wouldn't have done it in a previous time. And why? Because everything that he mentioned here, these other woes, they didn't put into practice what they taught. And ultimately Jesus said to his own disciples, practice what they do, but don't do like what they do. Listen to them, but don't do what they do. You snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell? Therefore I'm sending you prophets and wise men and teachers. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Others you will flog in your own synagogues and pursue from town to town. And that was what they did with Paul, even after Christ and his resurrection. And so upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. I tell you the truth, all this will come upon this generation. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you. How often I've longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. Look, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And in the name of the Lord is a direct reference to a representation of the righteous ways of God. And so there's this great differentiation of leaders. Obviously, in the Jewish culture, the priesthood was, in essence, the highest ruling order. It was separate from the governing order of the king, but the king was supposed to operate within the context of that priestly order, receiving insight, direction, cleansing, and otherwise, until Christ came and joined the two together as one in a spiritual practice. My point, though, is that you have this, in all the Analects that we read today, you have the example that is given by a righteous ruler, which is found throughout the Analects, the impacts that a righteous ruler has. But also the recognition that righteous rule, or this way of life, the life of virtue, is not limited to one who is a ruler. It is something that is meant to impact and be practiced in every arena of life and in every relationship, context, and situation of life. from within the home to the township and to the greater things all the way to the empire, the kingdoms and the empire.
Looking at it again with the 1320,
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate that you can. I might be reaching here, I'm not sure, but it almost feels like a progression of maturity as spiritual maturity when talking about the next best scholar officials. Bottom of the rung being what you were describing, the Pharisees of every time. The next best thing, at least being someone with a set of principles outside of a outward adherence to the law. At least there's inward work. The next person, someone who is respectful to the elders put in his life and yields to their will without necessarily having his own. And then the next, someone who understands the heart of his ruler's mandate and carries himself with shame or humility.
Yeah, let's open up. Briefly. What do you guys? What's the meaning of having a sense of shame? Sounds like a negative thing, but it's here presented in a positive light. So, what does it mean to have a sense of shame?
I can't really separate it in any other way. I mean, the good context, I see it as similar to humility.
Yeah, I mean, that's what Jaden just mentioned too. So
Yeah.
there's a.
I don't know how to look at it in any other way besides kind of the negative context of being regretful or shameful or bashful or something. I don't know.
Well, what's the opposite of shame?
Pride and prideful? Proud?
No. Honor.
Elaborate on that.
Well, here in the context, he's given representative or diplomatic assignment. And so, the sense of shame, and he says, and not dishonoring his ruler's mandate. So, if he goes and misrepresents the ruler, then that would be as a mark of shame for the nation. He will have dishonored or misrepresented
Okay, I see where you're going. You continue, but I get it now.
the heart, like you said, but in essence, the whole governing order. What's behind the reasoning, behind the way that ruler governs, and the way that they do, and the decisions that they make. When you go about as a diplomat, you are not yourself. You're not for yourself. You're not for your own ends or your own ideas. You wholly represent
If you recall what that gentleman
the
Two-Way
ruler
Ming,
that sent you. Who?
Two-Way Ming last night,
Oh.
what he was talking about as far as it being very much against the Confucian way to go out preaching about that way and intentionally trying to share it as if it were just this new belief system or theory, intellectual theory to others. That sense of shame is natural, necessary even for someone like a scholar official, because though they are carriers of the way, they are nonetheless put in a place where it is their duty to demonstrate it, and then to even to teach it. And so that causes a kind of healthy conflict in them, in the sense that it is almost, it would seem to be against their nature to be fulfilling their role as scholar officials, because it would it would seem to be somewhat at odds with what is the sentiment of the Confucian way, and not trying to boast or to to manually or strategically present the Confucian precepts to others, but that is really part of their capacity and their duty as scholar officials, is to oversee and manage those things. And so that sense of shame is a healthy way to temper the weight and burden and consequence of their positions. So it's a not thinking more highly of themselves than they ought to. It is definitely a kind of humility or deference. There's other places that Confucius will speak about the gentleman being one who carries, the way that he carries himself, or the way that he acts, is always in deference. It's always in respect. And that's definitely true, if not all the more true for a scholar official.
I think as well, in the light of that the part right after, a sense of shame and not dishonoring his ruler's mandate, conducting himself with a sense of shame, depending on, I guess, how you read that, could be a sort of burden, I guess, you carry as a recognition that in a way you are representing this way, and that a failure to uphold that standard, or a lapse in that standard for yourself, would bring dishonor not only to you, but it would misrepresent this way that you are trying to show. And so it could also be a weight in terms of a responsibility to uphold that honor. Walking, or what is it, conducting with a sense of shame. I don't know if that's necessarily a correct way to interpret it, but it feels like a sense of juxtaposition there between the dishonoring and the carrying with shame as a weight to not dishonor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I thought of it immediately as a sobriety
Mm-hmm.
that you carry.
And there's definitely this having a sense of shame is something that it's something within your inner person that would keep you from doing something that would cause shame.
That's what I was going for. Yeah, much better way of wording it.
And so, that then is juxtaposed to what it is to honor
Mm-hmm.
rather than to dishonor.
It's basically the reverse of the golden rule again. Instead of saying do things that do honor, do unto others as you would have them do. Don't do things that dishonor. Don't do to others what you would not have them do.
Mm-hmm.
It means the same thing. It's just the other way of saying it.
Benji, why don't you close us in prayer? You've been so talkative today.
Father, we
do seek to be, Lord, those who are upright, Lord, and wise, Lord, in your sight. Lord, to be ones who, Lord, live according, Lord, to their word. Lord, who practice, Lord, the things that are revealed, Lord. I pray, Lord, that you would give us patience, Father, to trust in you, Lord, to have, Lord, hearts that are postured, Lord, to receive and to be grown, Lord, in your righteousness. Lord, and again, I pray, Lord, that you would continue to unite us, Lord, under your standard, Lord, of living. Lord, that we would find rest, Lord, in knowing that, Lord, you are willing to do so, Lord, in our lives with a yielded and laid heart. Father, I am thankful for this time, Lord. May we, Lord, learn to honor it, Lord, and to, Lord, in our hearts, fear, Lord, the wisdom, Lord, your wisdom. Lord, would you continue to search our hearts and find, Lord, the things, Lord, that go against you, Lord, that oppose that standard, Lord, that you are seeking to, Lord, uphold us by and in. Lord, we want to be fully committed, Lord, fully given to you. Lord, I pray for a blessing upon each life here. Thank you for them, Lord. Give us, Lord, continually, Lord, a higher vision, Lord, an eagle eye, Lord, to see purpose and to live according to it. Lord, I pray that you bless the rest of our time today. Amen.
Amen.